This is Euroscopic, your weekly roundup of what happened, what's happening, and what might happen in and to Europe. In partnership with EU Observer, we bring you insights and reporting from their people on the ground across the European Union and beyond. Plus, interviews with European policymakers and analysts. I'm William Glucroft, a journalist who writes the Germany Substack newsletter called The Schland.
And this is Martin Gack.
We're recording on Tuesday, April 9th, 2024. We're discussing local elections in Poland, new UK tariffs on EU products, the big story being the International Court of Justice case in The Hague with Nicaragua, bringing Germany to confront charges of aiding and abetting an alleged genocide by Israel in Gaza. And we'll have an interview looking at global education and the EU's impact on that.
We're recording now.
All right. Well, Martin, you've certainly been in better shape, haven't you?
I have, but nothing about having a cold, which I'm sharing not only with my kids, but with every single one of their kindergarten friends, because, I go there and I cough with the rest of the kids. Is that, well, the benefit of it is that I get this kind of baritone radio voice. It's not quite as pleasant on this side as it probably sounds to our audience, but yeah.
Yeah, well, I know that our audience appreciates you muscling through and despite being under the weather, coming through for us on this episode anyway, so.
Somebody has to talk about Europe.
Exactly. Who not, if not us, who, right?
Yeah, exactly. So how are things? You'd been
I'm in The Hague right now. We'll talk about that later in this episode. The ICJ case just wrapped up as of recording right now.
There was yesterday an unequivocal political stumping speech by the new Irish Prime Minister, who was in Galloway. And he basically said that Ireland stands ready to recognize the Palestinian state. And there are now rumors that Spain will have recognized Palestinian statehood by July. Another interesting shift in European politics in this matter is France, which just, along with Jordan and Egypt, took the position that Israel has to essentially hold an unconditional ceasefire. So what about you? What other big stories this week?
Well, I think there's a smattering of smaller stories. One thing I thought was interesting was we had these local Polish elections that seemed to swing back in the favor of the previous, more populist party, the PIS, which is sort of the loathsome, feared boogie monster of all liberal and centrist and pro-EU parties and groupings everywhere around the EU. And there was all this celebration when the PIS was kicked out at a national level in national elections earlier this year, sort of on the back of a Donald Tusk-led mass coalition of disparate parties who had one thing in common, which was get rid of the Peace Party. And now they've come back a little bit in this local, at a local level. And I just find it interesting because it connects to me. It brought up something that we thought about and talked about in last week's episode, which was the Turkish local elections, where it swung towards more liberal, more centrist groups that are a little bit more cosmopolitan or open-minded, or however you want to frame it. But it's just so much amnesia and short-sightedness, and we jump on these small developments of trying to read the tea leaves of what this could possibly mean for the future of, goodwill in the world. It's all a bit silly, whether it's the Turkish local elections last week or the Polish, or 2 weeks ago, and Polish elections in the last few days, when, of course, it can be a number of factors that are fueling voters' desires one way or another. But, of course, looked at from 1,000 miles away and 1,000 miles above, there's all this speculation about what it could mean in the big picture. And I find these takeaways a little bit silly.
It's interesting simply from the point of view that, I think that as of like 2 or 3 weeks ago, everybody had pretty much discounted the PIS. Poland was now the new sort of, poster child for redemption. And what we're seeing is that, the PIS is by no means out of the game, and that, in fact, they actually are performed very strongly. I mean, Tusk's alliance will retain power. But I think that, notwithstanding what predictions we can make, I mean, that's a pretty strong sign as to where the political winds blow.
Exactly like I said last week, we saw this in Italy. Every time there's a change of government in Italy, sort of pro-EU liberal parties either celebrate euphorically or dread horrifically, depending on the result, whether it's in their favor or not. And I just find the political wind shifts so much, and they're based on so many factors, many of which are quite local and might not be even attached to some of these bigger regional or supranational issues, that it just makes people sound very silly to have these big sweeping takeaways about what it possibly means. Because exactly to your point, Martin, the PIS party lost after many years in power, but there's a give and take. There's an action-reaction cycle here, and being out for the count in one election does not say anything really about long-term politics anywhere, really.
So what else?
More fallout from Brexit. The thing that will never go away, and doesn't seem to ever stop bothering us, that there's new tariffs on EU products going into the United Kingdom, which much to the chagrin of UK businesses, which I find rather ironic. Now, I obviously can't cast aspersions whether these particular businesses or business groups or lobby groups were for or against the UK leaving the EU, but it's just another instance of, Brexit was sold as one thing, as freedom from EU bureaucrats, as, lowering costs of living, lowering regulation, these kinds of things. But you're really just kind of swapping one burden of bureaucracy for another burden of bureaucracy. And we're seeing that now again with this sort of application of new import tariffs for EU goods, which, of course, because the UK is not part of the EU anymore. So from both sides, either side has the right to kind of make their new rules.
Genocide concerns us all, wherever in the world it occurs.
So for our main story this week, we have sent William into the heart of the Netherlands.
The heart of international law.
Exactly. As intrepid journalist that he is, he has ventured into the halls of international jurisprudence to listen on the Nicaraguan case against Germany. And you were there yesterday and you were there today. So can you perhaps first bring us up to date as to what was on the table?
I mean, a fascinating case. Any international lawyer and those I've spoken with think that however this comes out, however judges at the International Court of Justice rule, it could really clarify or set new precedents for how international law and humanitarian law, specifically in regards to crimes against humanity and genocide, are viewed and interpreted. So this was a two-day oral hearing, very brief, 2 hours roughly on both Monday and Tuesday, 2 hours for Nicaragua on Monday, 2 hours today as we're recording on Tuesday, for Germany to give its defense. And essentially in early March, Nicaragua filed a claim essentially against Germany at the ICJ.
If I may interrupt, I mean, a filing in which an article of your authorship was actually cited. I would like to extend congratulations for entering the body of international jurisprudence.
Thank you very much. I should say it was in the company of many, many, many other citations and articles and research. But yes, an article I wrote about Germany's understanding of Staatsräson, reason of state, which is the basis of Germany's support for Israel, basically saying that Germany's support for Israel is sacrosanct. It cannot be questioned. It cannot be debated. It rises above sort of the normal levers of democratic transparency and power. Nicaragua used that among many other sources to file this case against Germany in the International Court of Justice in The Hague, which has jurisdiction over the Genocide Convention of 1948, which Germany and Nicaragua and more than 150 other countries, including Israel, are party to in one way or another. Germany without any reservation. So it's fully vulnerable to any clause or any article of the Genocide Convention, among other aspects of international law. Nicaragua basically accusing Germany of aiding and abetting, being complicit in what they call a genocide in Israel's campaign, specifically against Palestinians in Gaza, but more broadly, its occupation and its policy vis-a-vis the Palestinians more generally. Germany, as of course, rejects those claims and says, Nicaragua's beef is with Israel. And that is actually a sticking point in this case. There are two main sticking points, really. One, is genocide happening? And do we need to define what's happening as genocide before a country like Germany would be responsible for upholding its international obligations under the Genocide Convention? And the other one is, can genocide be defined here when the country accused of committing this genocide is not part of this case, right? Israel is not part of this case, as opposed to the South Africa case from several weeks ago, which directly accused Israel and brought Israel to the International Court of Justice. This is between Nicaragua and Germany, nothing to do with Israel.
But it's actually quite interesting, and I think it's something worth mentioning and repeating, and I think it doesn't get mentioned enough and repeated enough, is that the convention is not just a convention for the punishment of genocide. The convention is a convention for the prevention and punishment of genocide, which means that the prevention of genocide, all that those articles that are actually concerned with prevention need in order to kick in, is essentially for there to be sufficient suspicion or to be actually the possibility or the latent possibility of genocide. And that particular issue has already been settled in the jurisprudence that emerged from the preliminary sentence at the beginning of the year, in which the International Court of Justice, found that in fact there were sufficient reasons to suppose that Israel was committing genocide. This case could really open the gates for a whole host of cases against the U.S., for instance, to actually have to take a much harder position in relation to Israel, not because it is committing genocide, but because it is suspected of committing genocide, which is a sufficient
risk
to actually force a prevention.
Right, that there's a risk of genocide. Of course, the United States is in its own special category. It tries to, like in many aspects of international law, the U.S. picks and chooses when it wants to be culpable or be held accountable for international law. And the Nicaraguan side actually was very clear about that. One reason they're going after Germany is because Germany is a full-fledged member of the Genocide Convention and of other aspects of international law with no qualms, no exceptions, no caveats. And in the court of public opinion stands for international law, right? Germany is very much in its statements and its rhetoric a country that sees the importance of international law due to its own history, right? We have to remember that a lot of this international law is the direct result of its own historic crimes in the Holocaust. The Genocide Convention came out in 1948, just a few years after the end of the Second World War, as a direct consequence to make sure genocide could not happen again.
So what did the Germans have to say about it?
Mr. President, members of the court, the situation in Gaza is unbearable. Too many lives have been destroyed. Too many life plans shattered. We all want this to end, but this type of strategic litigation between proxies will not bring us closer to this goal.
So the Germans were very interesting. I think they were very classically German. They were very procedural. They were very technical. And their argument was, yes, what's happening in Gaza is terrible. Yes, we all, the global community, should make an effort to stop it and to make sure Israel is attacking Hamas while maintaining international law and protecting civilians. But, and here come the big buts, but first of all, this case will not change that. It will not meet anyone's goal of lessening violence against civilians. Two, Germany is not responsible for Israel's actions. As I said earlier, Nicaragua's beef from the German perspective is with Israel, not with Germany, and Israel's not part of this case. And C, they claim actually quite the opposite of what you just said, Martin, that there does actually have to be genocide proven or at least determined by a court like the ICJ before the convention would come into force. And they were citing a judgment from 2007 by the ICJ between Bosnia and Herzegovina and Serbia, Montenegro, where actually it says quite clearly in that judgment that a third country cannot be held responsible for the risk of genocide if a genocide has not been determined to have been taken place. And because a genocide has not been determined to have been taken place, in Germany's view, therefore Germany is not in violation of its international obligations. Of course, the Nicaraguan side say that's all technicality, that's all legalese, and does not get to quote the heart of the matter, which is Germany's support for Israel. It's sort of dragging its feet on trying to rein Israel's excesses in, and therefore making it culpable to any crimes and violations of international law happening in Gaza on Israel's watch and ultimately on Germany's watch.
I must say I have not heard the readout, but I mean, it does sound very much like some of my worst nightmares as I hang out in public buildings in Germany. There is some sort of obscure caveat, which is by and large nonsensical. Obviously, it is nonsensical to say that you can only prevent genocide once that it's been proven that genocide has been committed. By the time that genocide has been committed, prevention is no longer a possibility. I guess we can fairly sort of plainly agree on this.
That's exactly what Nicaragua said. It said if the court sides with Germany in this case, it will make the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, which is what the Genocide Convention is officially called, completely absurd and a complete joke. That is what the Nicaraguan side was arguing.
I do like the line of argument, though, not probably so much for what it says about the case, but for what it says about Germany. Nobody can really.
And another thing it says about Germany is on Monday, Nicaragua, each side, as I said, had about 2 hours to make their case. Nicaragua went about at easily 15, maybe 20 minutes over their allotted time. Germany, quite adhering to their international reputation of punctuality, they ended pretty much 12 o'clock on the dot.
But probably they started 15 minutes late, which is the dirty little secret that nobody tells you before you move in. Anyhow, so what's next? What should we expect?
We should expect a result, some kind of preliminary judgment in the next 3 to 4 weeks. Could be sooner, depends how quickly the judges want to rule. It's a large panel of judges. I think it's at least a dozen judges. I might be off by a couple. So if they come out at all on Nicaragua's side and issue provisional measures, that could have an effect, a very real effect on Germany's relationship to Israel, its weapons exports, other kinds of material support for Israel. However, it's important to note that while these rulings are binding to the parties that are part of the convention, there's no actual enforcement mechanism. The court has no way to meddle in the affairs of a nation state and enforce these rulings. However, when it comes to Germany, because Germany says, at least, and is on record of being so committed to human rights and international law, it would put Germany in quite a bind to basically ignore the court at its leisure after spending decades. Really, its entire post-war identity is built on two things: its commitment to Israel, based on Germany's view of its responsibility to the Jews, which of course is a highly controversial and contested idea that you and I have talked about and many others have talked about. And the other thing is its commitment to universal human rights, universal international law, that the rules are for everybody. Of course, those two things, particularist support for Israel, universalist support for universalist rules and laws for everyone, those can come into conflict sometimes. That's what we're seeing right now. And the other thing I thought that was very interesting is, and this doesn't really have a bearing in a legal sense, but what I found was interesting is Germany basically today in its defense said, you can't hold us responsible. The weapons and the support that we're sending to Israel have nothing to do with Israel's offensive operations, its ability to really defend itself, right? It's helmets, it's small arms, it's small stuff. And the numbers do bear that out, that most of its weapons are so-called other military equipment, not weapons of war. But then if that's true, then that basically makes a joke of Germany's claims of Staatsräson, because the whole idea of reason of state in Germany's mind is that the security and existence of Israel is tantamount to the security and existence of Germany. So they're basically saying, well, we're not helping Israel that much to the extent that we're violating international law, but that would mean that they're also not helping Israel actually defend itself like it claims that its reason of state requires it to do. So it's kind of in an existential bind either way, but probably Germany would rather go against its so-called reason of state than against international law.
Let's turn now to our interview with Laura Fragenti. She is the CEO of Global Partnership for Education, a major partner in EU development aid, specifically in education when it comes to the African continent. She joined us just before catching a flight to Brussels from Washington to take part in a high-level education conference. Laura, thanks so much for joining us this week on Euroscopic.
Thank you so much for having me. Absolutely.
Yeah, and it's well-timed that we're having this conversation because you're actually popping over to Brussels, or maybe by the time this episode comes out, you'll be in Brussels for this Global Gateway High-Level Education event, a very fancy term, being put on by the European Commission, the Belgian presidency of the Council of the European Union, and your organization being heavily involved in education, I can imagine has quite a role to play. So maybe you could just give us an understanding of what you're hoping to get out of this event and what this event even is.
Well, this is a very important event for us at a time where I would say that it is always very difficult to keep the attention going on the importance of investing in education. And to that effect, I have to say that I want to give kudos to the Commission that has been able, in a time of really duress and difficult choices, to keep the attention of its political leadership laser focus on education and maintain the 10% allocation of their ODA, Official Development Assistance budget, on the education sector. So this is a little bit an event that I think has two purposes. The first one is to wrap up on this cycle that is coming very close to an end, and then to really leave some legacy to the new administration that will come on the importance of maintaining this laser-focused attention and maintaining this strong investment on education for so many reasons that I'm sure we will have the opportunity to discuss during this podcast. You ask about our organization. The Global Partnership for Education is the largest fund that is exclusively focusing on education. We operate on about 90 countries, all lower, and I would say 90% of the middle income countries. And we have really been working very hard at maximizing the use of the resources that we have available through innovative financing. And this is the topic that I will be discussing, during the event. There is a strong attention on diversifying financial instruments. And so I think that the experience of our work will be good to that effect.
Laura, you mentioned how, these are troubling and difficult times. Money is tight. There's never a time when money is available for everything and that policymakers have to make choices. But there is this unsettling report from the end of February from the European Council on Foreign Relations, looking at a 4.8 billion euro slash of long-term development and climate funding, specifically destined for parts of Africa from European Union member states. What more can you tell us about that? And then we can get into more of the impact.
So the positive news is that until now, we haven't seen any sign of the budget to allocate the budget to education being cut. Obviously, I am only looking at that. I know that the budget on development touches on many more sectors, and so probably other sectors are being impacted. But from my more narrow angle, I have to say that I have seen continuity. I would say that the situation in Africa is particularly dramatic, with hundreds of millions of children, out of school, hundreds of millions of children living in very fragile situations. And you may have noted that this year the African Union declared 2024 the Years of Education. Now, while this is obviously an important, event and an important signal that give us a sense of a strong political commitment. On the other hand, I don't think that that would have been possible had not the leaders of the African countries noted that they are facing an emergency crisis. So anything that will reduce the already significantly reduced budget to the education sector, particularly for low-income countries, is going to be particularly negative. And that is one of the things that we really should be fighting against.
So you don't sound too worried, at least when it comes to education, the EU support. Can you outline a little bit, what is, when it comes to foreign development aid, what is the EU's role, specifically given your focus of African countries? What does that look like? What is that policy? What does that money go to?
So let me say, first of all, that it's not that I am not worried. I said that I'm always worried. That's my job, to worry about maintaining the level of resources consistent and, if possible, growing. So what I just said is that I do not see at the moment any signal that there is a reduction in the allocation for the education sector. So that's just to clarify. I feel that the EU has been a very important player. If I think about, for example, the context of our own global partnership for education, the EU is our largest donor. The Team Europe, meaning EU and all member countries through their bilateral system, do over 50% of the allocation to education. So they are really a very important player. They are focused on countries that need it the most. There is a very strong focus on fragile states and how to stabilize them. There is a strong, I would say, focus on education as an important element that will facilitate economic growth and transition to green growth. So I would say that all that connection comes very clear to the policies. Of course, I mean, if you talk to some of the member countries, they would tell you that while the allocation and the resources are generous, the processes are slow. And that's always a little bit of a problem with, large bureaucracies.
Laura, I wanted to ask you a bit about, current states of crisis. I mean, we have seen absolutely dramatic numbers concerning education in places like Sudan, certainly Yemen. And now we have sort of at the center stage in the discussion Gaza, where essentially massive swaths, if not the entire education system, has essentially been devastated by Israeli bombing. What role does the organization play, specifically when the road is so fraught with political questions?
Well, let me say two things. I mean, first of all, that the education system and what it offers to children is much more than just education. It's much more than the learning. A school offers a center of services. In many cases, the school meals that the children receive is the only meal that they receive per day. They receive health services. They receive, as I'm thinking about the kind of things that we are thinking about doing in Gaza as soon as the situation will allow us to operate, psycho-emotional support that will allow them to go back to normal. So when you look at the education in its own nature, there is so much more that is offered to the children. And this is why it is so important that they remain connected to the education system and that they stay away from school for as little time as possible. If I go back, for example, to some experiences that I had in, countries, the children themselves, they would tell you that routine of having to be in school every day at 8 o'clock and knowing that brings so much a sense of normalcy, a sense of control over their life that helps them then reignite the desire of having a normal life, a productive life, of playing, of joining again, their friends and the society, et cetera, et cetera. So, I mean, the school is really, 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 really important. And in that sense, I really feel that at times is a kind of an overlooked sector on how important it is to immediately invest in education in situation of crisis. And I think that the work that we have done in Yemen for all the years in which, this war has been going on, where basically GPE has been probably the only game in town that has kept school open and giving children really a sense of stability. The work that we are immediately thinking about redoing in Gaza is really something that is more important beyond the learning in itself. It helps society normalize.
Laura, I'd like to get more into that. You make a very clear case about how education helps the individual child, the individual student in their life, and of course, then their local communities, their societies. I'm interested in the bigger picture connections between education and economy, education and migration, education and climate, sort of these longer knock-on effects that education play.
Absolutely. So education is the foundation of what creates stable, productive, more equitable society. Because everything that happens in any context happens because there are skills that make it happen. To be able to generate that virtuous process of growth that then create jobs, that then create more stable society, that then reduces inequality, et cetera, you have to build those skills. If you do not have skills, people have a destiny of unemployment or low quality jobs in the informal sector. This is what we are seeing everywhere. This is why it is so important to invest in education, to make sure that that process ignites a process of growth at the local level. And here, that's the point for migration. I mean, when I was in a previous job working for the Italian government at the time when we were receiving very large number of economic migrants, we did some analysis of what was driving these people to come and what would have been something that would have prevented them, from coming. And everybody was saying that they were coming because they felt that where they were born, they didn't have opportunities. And opportunities is the way that people are describing now in a world that is so interconnected, where even the poorest people, they have access to information, so they see how everybody else lives, is just more than, putting 2 meals per day on a table. Is opportunities, a quality of life, is access to services, etc., etc. But the core of that was the fact that had these opportunities been provided to them, they would have not left. People only leave if they feel that there is no other options. And so investing in societies and making sure that these societies are able to provide people, young people in particular. I mean, if you think about Africa, in each and every country, the share of the population that is below 21 is growing, is enormous. So you have all this inflow of people that every year try to access the labor market without having, on one hand, the skills that potential opportunities would require. And on the other hand, anybody who is able to generate those opportunities in the countries where they are born. And so you need to break that circle and make sure that, people are trained, and then they can become 2 things. They can become the creator of opportunities if they have a business, for example, or they can become those who respond to these opportunities. But none of this happens without education. And I think that this is why, at times it is so, upsetting for someone like me to see that, because education is such a complex issue to disentangle, because it's a long-term investment, because it doesn't yield results in a couple of years. And so that doesn't really coincide well with the lifespan of attentions of political leaders. People shy away from education, and at the same time, they handle problems that are structural, like migration, for example, with emergency tools. And that is not the way to do that. I mean, you can only, you give the aspirin and the Band-Aid, but sometimes you really have to have a more structural, way of treating problems.
How committed, or perhaps the question is not how committed, but how seriously do you think the European machinery, I mean, even beginning with national governments, I mean, we know Meloni has been putting very strong accents on, as she likes to put it, helping people on their own territory, which, code word essentially for anti-immigration laws. But at the same time, I mean, one would assume that education becomes a very important instrument of those kind of political positions. So how strong do you see the European Union and its members taking education and the kind of services that come with education as tools in the migration policy projects?
So let me just say that I feel that in a way that there is a convergence of objectives, in a sense that, and you were making the example of Prime Minister Meloni, but I could, bring many more, other cases of EU and outside of the EU political leaders that are struggling with these issues. I think that there is now an awareness that that building the walls and keeping people outside is just not going to work. You cannot ring fence your own countries and just hope that everything else goes into places outside without intervening. So education is seen as an important element because people understand that to generate growth, you have to create skills. Now, the part that worries me always a little bit is what, I was describing before, that there is a kind of a discratic, tempo between the lifespan and the attention of political leaders that goes within their cycle, the tempo of education that goes well beyond the 4 or 5 years, of political cycle of individual politicians. And so that is something that, we really need to accompany with what I call education, if I may say so, of explaining to them that in a way they need to have a vision that go beyond their next, election. So I would say that comparing to years ago when I was, having the same type of discussions in very similar corridors with different people, where really there was a perception that you can just isolate a block of countries that are, performing economically well and just keep the other people outside. I think that this way of thinking has been defeated by events, that people have seen that there is no way the push factor towards better opportunities, better life, et cetera, and the globalization of, the economies in general, et cetera, has made it impossible to build barriers. So the other alternative, the only alternative left, is that if you are not able to build a wall, then you have to invest and create opportunities somewhere else so that the people, find the satisfaction of find what they are looking for in the places where they are born. And so that, I think that there is a very clear understanding of that with the leadership everywhere. What unfortunately, is that people keep asking me, for example, or our organization, or all the many very generous, donors to the Global Partnership for Education. They want results. What kind of results can we show in 2 years' time, in 3 years' time? There is very little, because the investment on an individual, if you think about that, you have to invest 12 years on one single individual to be able to make that person productive in such a way that that level of skills that he has acquired has a meaningful impact on his ability to generate an income. So multiply that for a society. It takes a long time. And that is the part where I really feel that in a way the decision of the EU Commission to keep this investment strong on education sector has been a very important one, because obviously they also have an influencing role on the decision of the member states. And on this, I am very grateful. In particular, I would say that Commissioner Urpilainen, she has really been a very strong advocate for education personally and in her public role. Now there is a change of government. We have seen, unfortunately, in several cases that bilateral governments have changed and the policy change, et cetera, et cetera. So this is why it is so important to have this conversation now at this juncture, so that at least there is a legacy that is left with whatever, administration is going to come, behind.
Yeah, and at this juncture, we're like 3 months now till European elections. The far right is gaining in polls. They'll at least have, or will most likely have some kind of spoiler role that they're going to play. Center-right parties are becoming more to the right to try to attract those far-right voters back. We're seeing this phenomenon all across the European Union. How worried are you about what the European Union looks like after these elections, exactly to the points you just made about this short-term focus in the political field versus the long-term work that you do in the policy field?
So let me just try to give a positive spin. I have never had in my own country a government that was so concerned about investing in education in Africa as the current administration. I wasn't expecting that. So if I scale this up, and if we find a way of creating convergence in objectives between, what are the geopolitical interests of individual countries and the Commission in whatever shape and nature is going to be configured, and global development, political, strategic objectives, then I think that has potential to work. I mean, in a way, even the most, extremist government, they are concerned about protecting stability in their own country. And they do understand that it's impossible to look at stability locally if you are not able to have a world that is more stable globally. I think that what we have seen in this past 3 years has pretty much everybody moved away from the idea that, after World War II ended, everything was going to be hunky-dory, because it's just is not. So to be able to protect your own space, you need to protect the neighborhood, and you need to protect, the area around the neighborhood. So that, to me, is probably we will have to use a different, line of reasoning. But I feel that, there is a way that there are opportunities to create a convergence on the objectives. And that is the job of the technical people. Technical people like me, like our organizations, are here to make politicians make better decisions on the basis of data. This is what we do for a living. So the challenge is on us. The moment that, we will have a new team, Europe in place, to be able to argue our case in a way that is convincing and that speaks to their own priorities.
Laura Fagenti of the Global Partnership for Education, the CEO of the GPE. Thanks so much for joining us. I think it's a great place to end on, with looking forward and your clever but still hopeful understanding of the political makeup to come.
Thank you so much for having me, and I hope we can have another opportunity maybe after the new administration is in place, so that we can see whether our predictions were right or wrong.
What's coming up next? What are you looking at?
Yeah, well, so there's yet another gate scandal unfolding at the European Commission level. This time it's called Piepergate. I love all the names they give to these various scandals, and I love how everything is a gate, right? Yep. So now we have Piepergate, which is named after Markus Pieper. He's a MEP and apparently a close ally of Ursula von der Leyen, and she appointed him to a job inside the Commission, which her own would-be allies or erstwhile allies in the Commission are sort of unhappy about, and they want more information about the transparency of this appointment, whether the right rules and procedures were followed, or, as some are alleging, whether von der Leyen just gave a nice job to one of her friends. And this is something that will be getting debated in the European Parliament as part of a larger question of European transparency on Wednesday.
Another two kind of interesting stories. One concerns Russian money in the European Parliament, and it seems that Czech, Polish, and Belgium security services or intelligence services had been closing in on MEPs who had been actually, getting paid to play by outfits associated with Russia. Apparently, some of this money has come from Voice of Europe. Voice of Europe is a Prague-based media organization which has apparently pretty strong Kremlin links and has been known for publishing pro-Russian propaganda. You can find actually a pretty good article from our friend Andrew Redman on the EU Observer. And it seems that over the next couple of weeks, the expectation is that both EU institutions, but also the Belgian's justice system, will start actually, in earnest investigations, and we'll begin to hear a bit more as to what exactly was happening. The other story, and I think that this one is really the bigger one, is that Brussels has told Cyprus that they will give them backup financial and infrastructure, really, on dealing with a new wave of migration coming from Lebanon. And the reason, obviously, why this is interesting is because it shows that, once again, a turbulent Middle East essentially turns very, very quickly into a potential migration crisis inside the EU. And I think that seeing this in the horizon, Brussels is turning to Cyprus and seeing if they can actually buttress, the bastions and the front line from a possible migration wave. The supposition is that this also means that Europe has a very strong interest in seeing a de-escalation between Israel, Lebanon, or Hezbollah in Lebanon, and Israel and Iran, because obviously if that were to turn into a full-blown war, then we would probably see a migration crisis.
That's it for this week's Euroscopic, written by us, produced by us, and edited by me, William. You can catch us every week either at our Substack, euroscopic.substack.com, or on euobserver.com. We'd love to hear from you, so be sure to subscribe and share your thoughts. Till next week, I'm William Bluecroft.
And this is Martin Gack.
Thanks for listening.